All right. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar on the proposed water and wastewater rates for fiscal years 2025 to 2028. We've just got a little bit of logistics here at the beginning. If you could go to the next slide. So we'll be presenting for about 30 minutes and we'll address questions after the presentation. You can ask your question at any time. You can enter it into the Q&A function in Zoom, and you can just type it in and we will get to it at the end of the presentation. We also want to share that we're recording the session, and the recording will be published to the city's website as well as translated into Spanish. And now I would like to introduce Joshua Hagmark, who is the city's Water Resources Manager.
Thank you, Ms. Wood, and welcome. I know those who are tuning in, this is a very difficult time. No one looks forward to rate increases, and that goes for city staff as well. And one of the challenges we've been facing, like many of you who are watching, is just so many things that we interact with have been going up. And we're going to be walking through and talking about that today. But it has far exceeded anything that we had or could reasonably have anticipated. We've seen electrical costs go up. We've seen construction double. Just unprecedented hits to inflation that we've seen over the last few years. And we have not kept up with our rate increases to meet that demand. And so during today's presentation, we hope to give you a better sense of what those main drivers are and what we're doing to try and control the costs. And at the end of the day, really are focused on maintaining that trust with you, the customer, and of course, continuing to provide reliable, high quality drinking water, and rest assured that we are treating the city's wastewater and safely releasing that back into the environment as well. And so with that, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Gabrielle Cook, the city's Water Resources Financial Officer.
Thank you, Mr. Hagmark. So good evening. As Mr. Hagmark said, I'm Gabrielle Cook. I'm the Water Resources Financial Officer. For tonight's agenda, we are going to first give some background into the timeline and how we got here and what's coming up. We will discuss the key drivers from financial planning and what the proposed rate increases will be paying for. And then the city's rate consultant, HDR Engineering, will be presenting on the rate study process and the conclusions from the rate study. Then we will take a look at the outcomes of the rate changes on sample bills and how we stack up compared to our neighboring agencies. And then finally, we will finish with some next steps, a couple water conservation tips and programs, and a Q&A session. We presented the rate study kickoff at the October 2023 Water Commission meeting. And since then, we've had regular public meetings with Water Commission, Finance Committee, and Council regarding the status of the studies and the proposed rates. So I'm going to give a brief introduction to the water and wastewater utilities and why it's so important to fund these programs. The water and wastewater utilities provide essential services that protect public health and the environment, and it takes an ongoing commitment of resources to continue providing these critical services. The water and wastewater systems represent some of the largest public infrastructure investments in our city. And replacing pipes and facilities, some of the pipes date back to the 1890s, requires significant funds to ensure safe, reliable service 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. So please keep in mind that proactive repairs and upgrades help avoid costlier expenses in the future. And as Mr. Hagmark was mentioning, the recent inflation has hit both of these utilities really hard, and it's driving the need for these significant rate increases over the next 4 years just to keep up with the cost of construction, operation, and maintenance. And for example, the cost to replace 1 mile of water main has doubled since 2020. So this is a high-level overview of the water and wastewater utilities. These two systems combined, they have over 600 miles of pipe. So that's essentially the distance from Santa Barbara to Sacramento and back. It's a round trip mileage. And it also includes 4 treatment plants, 23 pump and lift stations, 13 reservoirs, and 1 dam. So how do we fund these critical services? The water and wastewater programs, they operate as a nonprofit. So per state law, all revenue collected from providing water and wastewater services goes towards operating and maintaining these systems respectively. So these programs do not support the general fund, nor do they receive funding from it. And these utilities rely almost entirely on the revenues from water and wastewater bills to operate. And the utilities receive no funding from local taxes. The water rates, they're structured so that the utilities receive about 30% of the revenue from fixed charges. And the fixed charges on your bill, that's going to be your monthly service charge. And then about 70% of the revenue comes from volumetric charges. And those charges are for the actual water used. And so this allows our customers to have a little bit more control over their bills based on their water use. So looking to the left of the slide, I'm displaying a donut chart that shows the revenue sources for the water and wastewater utilities combined and their respective proportions. So as you can see, the revenue generated through rates make up just under 90% of the overall revenues. And as these utilities do not receive revenues from taxes or Measure C funding, we spend a good deal of time developing, analyzing, and tracking our rate revenue as we are so dependent on that revenue to run the utility reliably and safely. So this slide shows a functional breakdown of the wastewater and water budgets. So this is what your wastewater and water bills are paying for. As you can see, the majority goes towards reinvestment in the system, reinvestment in the infrastructure, and then the water and wastewater treatment and the water distribution and the wastewater collection. So our system costs, our revenues need to be sufficient to cover the operating costs and capital costs of the system. And this includes what we were referencing before, which is maintaining those 600 miles of pipe and the 4 treatment plants and the pumps and lift stations. And our revenues also need to meet state and federal regulations, pay the debt obligations, and maintain our reserves. So we break our costs down into 2 different categories. We have our operating costs and we have our capital costs. So our operating costs are the costs to run the system. They're the day-to-day operations. And this consists of electricity, chemicals, our staff, um, minor equipment, and so forth. And then our capital costs are investments in our physical infrastructure, such as replacing pipes and reservoirs. And they're typically large expenditure items that provide benefits over many years. And one thing to keep in mind is Santa Barbara is physically isolated and prone to natural disasters such as wildfires, landslides, droughts, and earthquakes and flooding. And this all contribute to the cost of operating and maintaining a water and wastewater utility. So, what are the cost trends that are impacting the need for these rate increases? The primary driver is inflation. The wastewater and water funds have experienced inflation that has outpaced the rates that were initially set to recover those costs. In particular, there have been sharp increases in insurance and construction costs. Our liability and property insurance, those have doubled in the past 2 to 3 years. Our construction costs have increased approximately 20% each year for the past several years. So I'm going to speak a little bit more to capital costs and investments. So the city's proposed rates will support capital investments in the water and wastewater systems to ensure that the city continues to provide safe and reliable utility services to our customers. On this slide, we have examples of large capital investments, one for wastewater and one for water. The city is planning to begin construction on the El Estero Water Resource Center electrical replacement project in the fall of this year. And this project will replace the 50-plus-year-old electrical system that is critical to operating the city's wastewater treatment plant. And on the water side, the city is replacing 2% of its water mains annually. The 2% replacement goal is in order to keep up with the water main failure rate and to prevent breaks. As noted earlier, we are experiencing a large increase in costs for capital work. And this graph shows how much it costs to replace 1 mile of water main. As you can see, these costs have doubled since 2020. And this is not a City of Santa Barbara phenomenon. These increases are seen industry-wide. There's other agencies like Tahoe and Big Bear that have experienced similar cost increases for water main replacements. And it's important to note that delaying capital investments will only make these projects more expensive in the future. Delaying this work could also lead to emergencies such as water main breaks that will be exponentially more expensive and disruptive than planned maintenance. So costs for emergency repairs are generally much higher than proactive repairs. And now I'm going to pass it along to Mr. Sean Korn from HDR, who will go over the rate study objectives and results.
Thank you, Gabrielle. So as we kick this off, a rate study is really coming back and developing that financial plan and proposed rates to meet those operating and capital costs that Gabrielle just talked about and laid out over the next several years. So in this case, we develop a standalone study for water and a standalone study for sewer, looking at the revenues for water as compared to the operating and capital expenses of water, as well as for sewer, the same approach, sewer specific revenues as compared to sewer operating and capital expenses. That is one of the requirements. I'll talk here in a moment about Proposition 218, which guides our legislative and legal requirements of establishing proposed water and wastewater rates. But ultimately, water revenues stay on the water side, wastewater revenues stay on the wastewater side. And so our rate study, as we go into it, we think about what some of those rate setting goals and objectives are. In this case, we talk about revenue sufficiency and stability. So are our rate revenues, which as you saw in the donut chart, are the vast majority of our revenues for both of these utilities, are they sufficient to recover the costs of operations and capital over this 4-year period? We also think about the stability of rates, of how we develop those and project those into the future and what that overall rate impact is and what that bill impact is to the customers as we go forward to try and smooth that out and minimize large swings in those rates. Another key element is looking at the affordability of the rates from the perspective of the entire city bill. So again, many of you get a city bill for water, sewer, and trash all on the same bill. And so looking at how those overall impact are to the customers is important as we go through this rate study. We look at efficient use of the resources. So this is one area where we've seen in the past many years where folks are conserving and reducing their water use. And that is one of the benefits or approaches that we use in the rate structure is that it is dependent. As Ms. Cook noted, it's 30% on the water side comes through the fixed charge, 70% is on the consumption charge. So the less water you use, the lower that bill can be. As part of this overall rate study, two of the key goals are establishing an equitable rate structure and a proportional by class of service. So looking at why we incur costs for water and wastewater, and who, as a customer class, residential, multifamily, commercial, or industrial, utilize and benefit from those costs and are distributed those costs proportionally based on the impacts they place on the system. When we review the rate structure, we also want to make sure that it's easy to understand and easy to administer. So if customers do have questions about how their bill is determined, then staff is able to easily explain that and can provide that information back to customers. We also want to make sure that our rates are legally defendable. As part of that, that is based on the requirements of Proposition 218. And on the next slide, we have a summary of the Prop 218 as it's known. And really, Proposition 218 was a constitutional amendment designed to protect taxpayers by limiting the methods by which local governments can create or increase taxes, fees, and charges without taxpayer consent. So for the water and wastewater utilities, that is why you received the customer notice, which had that information as part of when the public hearing would be, what those proposed rates are. And then that public hearing will be held where the council will, to city council will take those opposition votes or protest votes. And if there's not a majority protest, then the council may adopt rates up to the maximum levels that were calculated in this rate study. Now, one of the challenges with Proposition 218 over the last several years is that it is not or was not prescriptive in defining what cost-based means. Essentially, and in part, what Proposition 218 talks about is that the fees shall not exceed the reasonable cost of providing service, and the fees shall not exceed the proportional cost of providing service. And so that's one of the primary reasons for establishing a rate study and going through this process, is to be able to answer those two questions. One of the ways in which we do that is through the cost of service analysis, which one I'll talk about here in a moment, but ultimately it results in unit costs or cost-based rates. This develops the proposed rates for the first year of the rate transition plan, and it's based on the city's actual cost for the water utility and for the wastewater utility and for the fixed charge and for the variable charge or the consumption charge component. And we do that based on industry standard approaches. So the American Water Works Association and the Water Environment Federation have manuals that outline the approaches to establish proportional rates, and then those are tailored to the city's specific system and customer characteristics for each of the utilities. And ultimately, that provides us that nexus or that relationship between the cost of providing services, so what are our expenses, our operating and capital side, and how we recover that through the fixed and variable charges to the customers that provide the revenues to the city. So that lays out our approach as we go through this. On the next slide, to accomplish that, we go through a three-step process, and that's the revenue requirement, the cost of service, and the rate design. The revenue requirement you can think of as the financial plan. This is where we compare the current revenues at the rate levels today, the number of customers, the amount of billed consumption on the water side, similar approach on the wastewater side, and we compare that to those operating and capital needs. Now, when we think of the capital needs, there's a couple key components of that, of how we fund that capital. Some of that capital is paid for on an annual basis or pay-as-you-go through annual rate revenues. What cannot be funded on a pay-as-you-go basis, large one-time projects such as the electrical project at El Estero, we fund through long-term borrowing. I'll talk about some of our approaches to that here in a moment as well. But ultimately, that revenue requirement provides us with the cost basis of the amount of revenue we need to collect from each utility on a standalone basis. Once we know the cost, then we can develop the cost of service analysis, which really meets the intent and requirements of Proposition 218. And we look at why do we incur costs. So on the water side, we look at how we incur costs based on average day or capacity demand, or those peak use periods where we have to size the facilities to meet overall system needs. On the wastewater side, it's based on the total volume and the strength of that volume. So when we think about what's coming to the El Estero plant for treatment and eventual disposal, then the higher the strength, so think commercial or industrial customers, there is a different charge for them based on how they impact the system, because they have a higher strength and thus a higher charge to reflect that. Based on that cost of service, we have, as I mentioned, our unit costs, which become the rates in year one of our proposed rate transition plan. And that provides what I refer to as the reset year. So we reset based on our actual costs that we see in this current period. And then we project those in years 2 through 4 based on the overall percentage adjustment that we've identified in the revenue requirement. Based on that, we set rates for the 4 years. Then ultimately, when the city goes to set rates again, they would reset in that year one and project rates again for a multi-year period as part of that process. Now, some of the things I mentioned on the next slide, we have some of the ways the city has been looking at and processing and minimizing the impacts to customers through funding approaches as well as customer assistance programs. So on the left-hand side, we have our financial planning components, and that's really looking at what our prudent investment in the water and wastewater systems are and how we're funding those. So as Ms. Cook noted, being proactive and going out and replacing those mains that are failing and are breaking at regular intervals, the 2% or 6 miles of pipe each year provides us with that approach to reduce those costly emergency repairs that you've had recently with water main breaks. As part of our funding approach, the city is always looking to obtain grants when available for specific projects. But as an example, the couple of projects we have here in this rate study period are funded with low interest loans. And those low interest loans have much lower costs of borrowing than what it would be if the city had to go out into the financial markets and borrow for a municipal revenue bond. And so in some cases, those low interest loans have rates less than half of what the overall market rates are for similar projects. The city also has outside water supply agreements selling excess or available water to other agencies in the region. And then we do have some ability to offset and use reserves to fund our capital costs in the future. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in the end. The city has laid out customer assistance programs. There's water checkups. This is where city staff can help you go through and review your water use and those areas that you may need assistance on. And that'll be talked about a little bit more before we end this evening. There's also different programs such as the leak relief, the utility tax waiver for income qualified customers. There's rebates and payment plans as well. So there's different approaches that the city has implemented. And as part of that, the city recently partnered with the Alliance of Water Efficiency for a water rate affordability study. And that study evaluated different affordability challenges specifically for the city and the city's customers, and also outlined some potential solutions and options for low-income assistance programs that the city is evaluating and will be working through here in the near term as possible future programs that can be used for the city's water and wastewater rates. So on the wastewater side, looking at our revenue requirement, so the difference between our current revenue from wastewater and the total operating and capital needs, we've projected an overall rate revenue increase of 9.5% annually each year for the next 4 years. And really, as was mentioned earlier, that's driven by the impact of inflationary costs that occurred over the last several years and catching up to those costs as we go forward, as well as funding those necessary capital improvement projects. So such as the electrical project at El Estero, and maintaining the collection system and rehabilitating 1% of sewer mains annually. So those costs are being funded within that. I will say the 9.5%, you'll see this here in a moment, is not necessarily the bill impact that you as a customer will see in the first year of the rate adjustment. And that's because of our cost of service, which, as I mentioned, resets our overall costs. So for wastewater, that resets that fixed service charge as well as that volume charge for all of the customers. And then ultimately, we've been working through this process and utilizing reserves to minimize those rate increases going forward. On the water side, similar approach, but water specific costs. The overall rate revenue increase is 10.5% in fiscal years 25 and 26, so the next 2 years, and 10% for the second 2 years in fiscal years 27 and 28. Again, that's reflecting the impact of those inflationary costs to operations and maintenance, as well as the capital investment of replacing 2% of the city's water mains. And as Ms. Cook showed you, the increase in those costs of replacing mains, as well as other key infrastructure and capital improvement projects increasing, which are based on the cost of those improvements being put into the system. Same message here, depending on the water side, your overall amount of water used each month, your bill impact will vary. So each of the tiers, and we'll show some bill comparisons here in a moment, ultimately will depend on how much you use. So that could be 10.5, it could be a little bit less, it could be a little bit more, depending on how much water you use. And in the same vein, using available reserves. And that was one of the key discussions that we had on reserves on the next slide with the Water Commission, the Finance Committee, and the full City Council, was trying to minimize the impacts to rates over the near term by utilizing available reserves. So what you see here on these two charts, we have wastewater on the left in the green, and we have water on the right or in the blue. The dashed lines are the city's policy minimum reserve target. So that is the minimum amount of reserves that each utility should have on hand based on the city's policies. What we've done as part of this process is that on the water side, on the right chart, you can see that we're below that target outside of this rate setting period. So the rates we're looking at right now are fiscal years 25 through 28. We don't reach our target minimums until fiscal year 29. On the wastewater side, on the left-hand side, you can see that we carry existing reserves, we're using those, and then those will be replenished by fiscal year 2030. So one of the approaches we took as part of this study was not meeting those target policies as we worked through this with the City Council to minimize the overall rate adjustments as much as we could going forward. And with that, I will turn it over to Ms. Cook to talk about the utility bill comparisons.
All right, thank you, Mr. Korn. So what does this mean for you? This slide shows the rate impacts for the city utility bill, which includes charges for the 3 utilities: water, wastewater, and trash recycling. So this chart shows the bill for a typical single-family residence with average water usage of 8 HCF a month. And HCF stands for 100 cubic feet, and that's our measuring unit for our bills. And 748 gallons is equal to 1 HCF. So this chart shows the bill for the typical single-family residence with average water usage of 8 HCF, wastewater service, and 65-gallon trash, green waste, and recycling pickup once a week. So you'll see that the total bill increase is $11.66 a month, or just under 5%. In the next couple of slides, we're going to show how the City of Santa Barbara's wastewater and water bills compare to our neighboring agencies. So this slide focuses on wastewater bills for single-family residences. And as Mr. Korn was mentioning, the rate structure for residential wastewater rates are composed of 2 key components. So you have your fixed monthly base charge, and you have your volumetric charge, which is based on water usage. So this means customers are able to reduce their wastewater bill by using less water. And most neighboring agencies charge a flat rate for wastewater. So on the left of the slide is the bill comparison for the low water user, which is 4 HCF, and on the right is the bill comparison for an average water user, which is 8 HCF. As you can see, the city has competitive rates compared to the neighboring agencies, and you can see how the lower usage has a lower bill for Santa Barbara, and when you get to a little bit higher, it increases that bill, but the other agencies are stagnant. On this slide, we have the typical water bill customers for users of 4 and 8 HCF. And similar to the wastewater residential rates, the rate structure for the water residential rates are composed of two key components. So you have your fixed monthly service charge, which is based on the meter size, and then you have your volumetric charge, which is based on the amount of water used. On the left is the bill comparison for a low water user using 4 HCF. And for the low water user, you can see that the city has the cheapest water in the area. And on the right is the bill comparison for an average water user, which is again that 8 HCF per month. And for the average water user, the city has competitive rates compared to their neighboring agencies. So now we'll take a look at the bill impacts for our multi-family residences or our apartments and condos, also known as apartment condos. So this shows the total city utility bill for a multi-family residence using 4 HCF a month. And you'll see that the total bill increase is less than $10 a month. And in this comparison, the trash and recycling charges were not included, as those are typically paid by the landlord or HOA. And this slide shows the bill comparison for apartments on the South Coast. So both the water and wastewater bills are calculated using that 4 HCF, as that's the average use for a multifamily residence. And on the left is the bill comparison for wastewater, and on the right is the bill comparison for water. So similar to the single family residence bills, the city has the cheapest water in the area for low water users, and the city has competitive wastewater rates compared to our neighboring agencies. So we showed you a couple of example bills, but if you're interested in the bill impacts specifically for your level of water usage, we have a water rate calculator available online. And we highly encourage customers to use this online water rate calculator to see how the new rates could impact their bills. And you can find it at santabarbaraca.gov/rate calculator. So next steps. City Council will hold a public hearing on the proposed wastewater, water, and trash recycling rates on June 25th at 2 p.m. And Council will consider adopting these rates on July 2nd. And if adopted, the rates will be effective July 2nd. This webinar was specifically for the proposed rate increases for water and wastewater. So if you would like more information about the proposed trash and recycling rates, please visit santabarbaraca.gov/recycling. And a water presentation wouldn't be complete without information on conservation. So I'm going to pass it to Madeline, who will talk about a couple of our water conservation programs.
Thank you, Ms. Wood. So in our pre-webinar survey, we had a request to touch on WaterSmart and other resources to save water and reduce bills. So here are some of the programs available to you. WaterSmart is our new customer portal that was rolled out about 2 months ago. And on the screen here, you can see detailed water use information. So this is available to register your account if you haven't already. About a third of our customers have done so. And you can see detailed water use information by the year, the month, the week, the day, or even the hour. So if you access it on a laptop, you can see the hourly water usage. If you're looking at it via phone, the most granular you will see is the day. So we really encourage people to use a laptop or desktop computer so you can see the hourly water usage. Here on the screen, you can see a typical irrigation pattern of 300 gallons used between 7 a.m. and 8 a.m. And then the rest of the day's water usage is pretty minimal compared to that. So it's a really good opportunity for folks to take a look at where they're using water and how they might be able to program timers differently or evaluate ways to save water in their landscape. The other resources that I have on the screen here, as you can see, a lot of it is geared towards outdoor irrigation and outdoor water efficiency. We've got a variety of rebates. We have a lawn replacement rebate. We have irrigation rebates for smart timers, drip irrigation, efficient sprinkler heads, gray water. We have a mulch delivery rebate to help reduce evaporation. We have high efficiency clothes washer rebates. And then if hourly water use is still not quite enough, we also have a flume rebate, which is basically an app on your phone and a little device on the meter that will give you minute by minute water usage. And that's very handy as well. The flume will alert you for leaks, and WaterSmart will also alert you for leaks. So if you have continuous water usage, that's one way that we want people to really focus on conserving water, is nipping those leaks in the bud and getting alerts on leaks. And so both of those devices are very helpful for that. We also have a variety of irrigation videos, gardening classes, and other resources that focus on how to be more efficient at your home or business. And if we can go to the next slide. That wraps up our presentation for today. We encourage folks to enter any questions that they have in the Q&A feature. We also have down below on the screen the webpage where all of this rate information is posted. We have public meetings posted on there, and the recordings in English and Spanish will also be on that page. All right, let's see for questions coming in. All right, here is our first question. So we have had 2 rainy years. So why are the rates continuing to go up?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that question. That is a great question. We've had that come up a couple times. So the majority of costs to operate the city's water system and to deliver the safe, reliable drinking water, they're primarily fixed. They don't change based on the water supply availability. So the only really variable costs are our electricity and the chemicals. So regardless of how much it's rained, the city still needs to operate and maintain these systems. The water system has, I believe it's over 300 miles of water main, and I think it treats 10 million gallons of water a day. So we still need to run the facility, and these are pretty much fixed costs.
Great, thank you, Ms. Cook. And this question digs into the different tiers, because we were talking about the tiers of usage. So why do the different tiers go up by different amounts?
I can answer that one. So that's a really good question on how we go through the process of establishing the rate structure. And as I mentioned, one of the requirements of Proposition 218 is that we provide the cost basis for each of the charges that we have. So as we're talking about our fixed service charge, we have to come back in the cost of service to define that. And we have to do the same thing for our tier pricing. And so each of those tiers is based on the cost of providing water in that tier based on the overall supply portfolio that's available and the prioritization of that supply portfolio for each of the tiers. And so as part of this rate study, we looked at what those current costs are today. That's that reset year in year 1 of our 4-year rate transition plan. And that's based on those actual costs of providing water in that tier. And then the out years are increased based on the overall rate adjustment. So that's why they're slightly different, specifically in year 1. And then it's also that percentage change on the overall value or the dollar amount of those tiers as we go forward.
Great. Thank you so much, Mr. Korn. Another question, does the city use a bid process for water main replacement?
Yes, I'll take that question. That's a great question. Yes, so the city does bid out all of its projects, but particularly the water main job does get bid out. Like I said, this is an annual project, and a lot of local contractors go out after this project. So we have some pretty good local competition. But yes, we do award it to the lowest responsive bidder. And as frustrated as I've gotten with the increasing costs, we are working with that. In fact, I've had both of the bigger, I should say, contractors come into the city, and we've sat down to see what more we can do to kind of bring down the cost. Again, they're seeing their labor costs going up. They're seeing materials go up for them as well. They've had to replace a lot of their vehicles to meet California air quality standards. So they're seeing their costs going up as well. I'd say one of the saving graces is these contractors are local, which means their people primarily are local. They're spending, having lunch here in town. So that money is staying local. It's not going down to a contractor in LA or somewhere else. So I do feel fortunate, at least specifically with the water main and the sewer main work that's being done. It's going primarily to local contractors.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Hagmark. Well, those are all the questions that we have submitted today. If you see down below Gabrielle's information, her email is down below. If you have any other follow-up questions, it's also available on our webpage. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight, and I hope you have a wonderful evening.